Welcome to episode 6 of the Wayback Wayne show. I'm your host, Wayne. In previous shows, we have featured the very popular 1960s groups, the Sounds Unlimited, of which I was the drummer, the Dawn Five, and Sir Winston and the Commons. In this special show, we're going to zoom to England to talk with Mr. Tim Quinn, who was born and raised in Liverpool. His entire life has revolved around entertainment. Are you ready for this? At age 16, he left home to become a circus clown. There's a first on our show. This is the first circus clown we've ever interviewed. Then he went on to work in English theater on the BBC television network. Tim wrote, he created, and he published many comics, magazines, and documentaries. Also, we're going to talk about his involvement in music. After all, celebrities have been present at every turn in his career. As an example, from the Pope to Hugh Hefner and the Beatles to Stan Lee. Collectively, Tim has spent years as a successful script master and illustrator and editor. Are you ready for this? Tim was the editor for the world-famous Spider-Man, X-Men, and the Incredible Hulk. Well, now back in England, Tim enjoys nostalgia of comics while running a management company for recording artists. And he is working on a few other projects that we hope to be able to talk with him about in the future. Well, enough said. Let's join the conversation with Tim. Well, I was going to start out here with that. You know, it seems that your life has been involved in many highly successful entertainment pursuits.
And, I've been involved with many successful and indeed many big failures, because that's the life in the arts, isn't it?
We'll talk about the successes.
Well, I don't mind talking about the failures. I think it's important to talk about failures because if anybody going into this business, they have to realize that, guess what? Chances are you have more failures than you do successes. But
right.
Is it worth it still? You betcha, you know.
Okay. Hey, have you ever been a musician yourself or written and published things that you wrote?
That's a really good question. I have the look. You have to admit, I have the look, and that's all I have. I'm the only person who was born and bred in Liverpool back in the good old days, as we call them, who couldn't play or sing a note. Back in 1963, I bought a guitar and I bought a book that was called, what was it called? It was called Play in a Day. It was a very famous book. All the top musicians had bought that book, Play in a Day. Now, the only problem for me with that book is it didn't stipulate which day that I would be playing. And I'm still hopeful, and I still have my guitar up in this office. But no, I have no natural rhythm. I have no ability in that area. But boy, do I fall down and praise all people who do. And growing up in Liverpool in the 50s, there was music coming out of every door. It was a truly exciting, amazing place to be a boy growing up in, because outside of music, it was completely different. It was still a very Victorian country. It was Victorian in so many ways, particularly at my school, which was run by a bunch of bozos called Irish Christian Brothers, who were not so much Victorian as medieval. And outside of...
They were pretty much responsible for your education, weren't they?
They were indeed, or my lack of education. I mean, one of the first things I figured out was how to play truant, because school and I did not click in any way whatsoever. They wanted me to be a priest. Well, that wasn't going to happen in this lifetime, or a bank manager. Well, I can't count. I was away the day we did maths at school. So I still have problems. Luckily, my wife, Jane, from Fishers, Indiana, is a great counter. So we thank goodness for that, else I would be in serious trouble down the years. But no, school didn't click. And it was weird to be in a school where our textbooks were all printed in the 1880s, even though it was now the 1950s and the early 60s.
They're just a little bit slow catching up.
They were a bit slow catching up. And yet outside, whenever I came out of the school, there was this extraordinary music playing all across Liverpool. Because some people think, oh, yeah, it was the Beatles came from Liverpool. Well, yeah, they did. But so did 300 other bands at that time. And they were all unique and they were all different. And many of them did go on to have impact globally. So for a boy in school, it was like, who am I going to look at? These teachers who are like something out of the ark, or these guys who are actually having fun by doing what they love doing. So I knew I had to get into the arts in some way, but it was figuring out what way. And there was no Google back then. So you couldn't just Google, what should I do? Or where should I go? I have certain talents. Indeed, in my last year at school, I was called in for careers advice, as they call it. And the teacher said, so what do you like doing? Which is a good question. And I said, well, I love writing and I love drawing and I love telling stories in pictures like comic books. And his words to me were, comic books, Quinn? Are you deranged? And then he said, well, if you can draw, I suppose you could try going to Lewis's. That's a big department store in the centre of Liverpool, because they need people to write the price tickets for the windows, because this was pre-computers, of course. So that was the extent of my careers advice. So I left school. It's still the 60s. And we did things, you may remember, we used to do things on a whim back then. Oh. If we thought, yeah, this is a good idea, we'll do it. And I remember my elder brother came up to me and he said, so what do you want to do? What do you really like to do? I said, I want to do something that proves I'm alive. Because the last 3 years at school had put me into a stupor. You know, it was so everything that I wasn't. And I just wanted to prove that I had a pulse. And on a whim, I suddenly thought, you know what? There's a circus just up river from Liverpool. And it's in a little town called Blackpool, which is quite a famous place over here, a seaside resort. And so I got on a coach the day after leaving school, went up to Blackpool. I'd never been there before. Got off. I saw this huge tower like the Eiffel Tower in the centre of the town, which it's famous for. And I knew the circus was under the tower. So I made my way there, found the stage door, knocked on it. And the door was opened by the first celebrity I had ever met. And this was a man called Charlie Caroli. And he was very famous over here. He'd been famous for 40 years at that time as a clown. And he was in full makeup with the little bowler hat and the nose and so on. And he looked me up and down. And I looked like a scruffy Liverpudlian of the period, because I had long hair and I was 16. And he said, what do you want? And I said, any jobs going? And again, he looked me up and down and he said, follow me. And so I followed him into the circus. We crossed the ring, the circus ring, to his dressing room, and he sat me in front of the mirror, and there were all these 100-watt light bulbs all around it, all switched on. And I was like, hey, man, this is showbiz. You know, those 100-watt light bulbs, which you're probably not allowed to have anymore due to global warming. And he then went to a cupboard and he pulled out this white slop and put it on my face. And then he found a red nose and a funny wig, which I hardly needed, as you can see, and some fancy clothes. So a day after leaving Catholic school, I was actually a clown at Blackpool Tower Circus in Britain, and running in and out. His advice to me, well, not his advice, his warning to me was that I was to run into the ring when he went, and to throw buckets of water at him and his fellow clowns, but to make sure I missed. And I thought, I can do this. I'm sure I can miss. So I run in, and it's the first audience that I'd ever seen. And it was like 10,000 people in this. and they're all laughing and they're all happy and they're all joyous. And suddenly my pulse switched in, and it was like, man, I love this. This is great. And I threw the water and I missed them. But then I stopped because I just turned 16 the week before.
Yeah.
And
well,
suddenly
that's what makes our show here kind of unique. I say to our people who are listening, hey, when was the last time that you ever met a 16-year-old who ran away from home and became a clown? I mean, that's a real exclusive here in the States here.
Only in the 60s. Only in the 60s. You know, there was something about
that. When I was looking at some of the things that you've been involved with, that kind of leads into a question that, you know, how inquiring minds in the United States here, we always want to hear big names and stars and all that sort of thing. But
I've got them.
You have a management company and you manage recording groups that they're in England. And I was hoping that this morning you'd share a little bit with us.
Absolutely. No, I'm more than happy to. That came quite a few years later after my experience as a clown, because by the end of that season, I did realize I'm not a very good clown, because a clown is a magnificent creature. There's a lot of people who dress up with the funny nose and they say, look at me, I'm a clown. No, you're not. You're just a dope. But real clowns are people like Charlie Chaplin and Stan Laurel and so on, you know, magnificent. And I think you have to be born with it. And well, I didn't have that. So I left in search of myself still. And through a series of rather odd adventures, I found myself, first of all, working in the theatre backstage as a stage manager and so on, where I started encountering extraordinary talents, amazing people, because suddenly I was working for the BBC over in Britain, and there was a fantastic series that ran for 30 years on British BBC television. You can still find some of the episodes on YouTube, and they're worth. This TV series was called The Good Old Days, the BBC's Good Old Days. And the premise was that it was a night at the music hall back in the Victorian age. And famous people of today would come along and get togged out in Victorian gear and do an act. And that was, again, my first experience of every week meeting really amazing people and just being bowled over by them. And I truly found myself there because I started writing scripts for comedians, found that, oh, you know what, I can write, and I can write scripts to, if they gave me, you know, the idea behind it, what this is what we want, I could write a script out of it. So suddenly I was being paid a fair amount of money, I have to say, to do this kind of thing. But I was also meeting these amazing people who were incredibly inspiring. And one of them in particular who stands out, even though it's now over 50 years ago since I met her, she came to this theatre, this old musical, and that was Eartha Kitt. And Eartha Kitt, you may remember, was an extraordinary creature in so many ways. I mean, her life story is astonishing. And also, on top of everything else, she was Catwoman in the Batman TV series of the 60s, which, as we all know, is the only true Batman that has ever been created. Bless Adam West and Burt Ward. She was just astonishing, and again gave me this kind of push into believing in myself, I guess. And I started, one of my loves as a kid had been comic books. I mean, it was the 50s and 60s, and comic books were exploding everywhere. So along with loving music, I love comic books, and I found I could do that. I could write. And so I started creating comic books and writing for established comic book series. Now, this in turn led me to America. But what really led me to America was a girl from Fishers called Jane Gatewood. She and I met up in a very strange way. We found that we loved all the same things because we were pretty much the same age. Even though she had grown up in Fishers, I'd grown up in Liverpool. We'd been hit by the Beatles. and all these other bands of the period. We absolutely adored them. And while I ended up making quite a successful career working for Marvel Comics in the US, after experiencing a few years working for the Saturday Evening Post magazine in Indianapolis, where I was the humor editor, working for Marvel was a blast, but Marvel led me into working in television. And I started creating documentaries for a very famous British television series called the South Bank Show. And during that time, one of the ideas Jane and I came up with was, why don't we do a documentary about an American singer called Julie Felix? Now, you're looking blank because you're thinking, well, who's Julie Felix? I know my singing. Well, the reason you're looking blank, Wayne, is because Julie was this Mexican California girl who had the bright idea back in the early 60s of coming over to Britain. And she met David Frost. You'll remember David Frost from his interviews with, well, everybody on the planet. And David Frost put her on his TV show because he really liked her. He thought she was a great singer, and she was, and a great songwriter. And she made a name for herself here, and indeed across Europe and Australia and so on. And then she disappeared from the end of the 60s, well, from the mid-70s, she disappeared. Jane and I suddenly found her, this is in the early 90s, and she was appearing in a tiny little pub in Devon near Dartmoor, where the Hound of the Baskervilles round. And we went along to see her, and we thought, she's got a great story to tell, because once upon a time, she was up here in Britain. She had her own BBC TV series, and her guests on it were members of Led Zeppelin, just every pop name of the mid-60s. I mean, it was an incredible thing that she did. She was astonishing and a true talent. So Julie said, well, that'll be interesting, because she was trying to make a comeback. And she took me along to meet her agent manager. And this agent manager, and this is how Jane and I got into the management business. This agent manager sat there, and he turned to me and he said, you know what Julie's problem is? And I thought, what a stupid thing to say to begin with. You know, he's just met me and he's doing this in front of Julie. He said, Julie's problem is she doesn't realize that I'm the cog at the center of the wheel, and she is merely a spoke. Well, now I have a true feeling for artists. I certainly had a true feeling for Julie. And so I turned to this man and I said, sorry, did you say the cock at the center of the wheel? And he said, no, the cog. And I'm like, well, I've never heard such nonsense. We came out of the meeting. He was putting Julie into awful dives to play. And I said to Julie, you've got to get a better manager, because this guy's awful. And she sort of was angry with me at saying that, because you have to believe in your manager, you have to believe in your agent. She turned to me and she said, if you think you can do better, do it. So I went home with Jane and we discussed it. And we said, well, it's hardly brain surgery, is it? Being a manager. First thing we did was to contact people we knew in the business. And we asked for everybody to tell us if they knew of a good agent or manager. And funnily enough, everybody wrote back saying there's no such thing as a good agent or manager, having been bitten by many an agent and manager. So we thought, well, let's try and be a good agent. You know, my sort of, the person I held in high esteem was Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. I thought he'd done an amazing job. And indeed, it is a fact that without him, they wouldn't have got out of Liverpool, no, despite their talent. He's what made it work. So Jane and I sat down, we had a telephone, we started phoning venues. We came up with all the blurb that you need to, because we were dealing with young people who hadn't been around in the 60s, so they didn't have a clue who Julie was. I remember one day, I got this young twit on the phone, and he was a manager of some theatre somewhere. And I said, I'm representing Julie Felix. He said, oh, she then? And I said, oh, huge name. She opened for Bob Dylan at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. And you could compare her to Dylan in many ways. You know, singer-songwriter. She was a protest singer initially. A real wonderful, wonderful talent. And he said, well, she's like Bob Dylan. And he said, I said, yeah. And he said, oh no, we wouldn't want something like that here. So had I been trying to sell Bob that day, he wouldn't have got the gig, which shows the mentality of some of the plonkers that you find running venues up and down the country. But we persevered. And before we knew it, we had Julie out on a 40-date tour of British dates in really beautiful old theatres. Have you been to this country, Wayne? Because, boy, just the tour of the theatres is a joy. There's hundreds and hundreds of them, and they are lovely. A lot of them are ancient and a real joy to play. So we set Julie out. We were acting as her management, as her agent, as her roadies, and the tour worked. It worked for Julie. We had upped her fee considerably, and it worked. Now, she was in her early 60s by that time, and the idea was, okay, this might be a final hurrah, but it worked so well that, of course, she wanted more. And it wasn't long before she said, so what are we doing next year? And so we had to start putting in place another tour to follow this one. And then I thought, well, look, we need to contact everybody out there. We need people to know about this. And I thought back to Julie's TV series in the 60s, where she had as guests all these huge names. And I said, let's call in some favors, because you did them a favor putting them on your show in the 60s. Why don't they do you a favor now by let's first of all, let's put together an album, a new album. Maybe we could do an album of Bob Dylan covers, because she and Bob Dylan were linked. And we this was the 90s, so Dylan had a fair back catalogue by this time. And we suddenly realized, you know what, it better be a double album. And then we put out the call to various people. Before we knew it, we had members of Led Zeppelin coming on board. We had Kiki D, Kiki D with Elton John, and various other wonderful musicians who were going to come and back Julie on these tracks. And they were all doing it, not because they were doing her a favor, but doing it with love, because they remembered her fondly. Now, what this allowed was for Julie's name to suddenly travel all over the internet, because she was being mentioned on their websites. And so record sales kind of went through the roof instantly. And the happy thing about the record sales is that it was our own record company, because we decided we'll create this record company, Remarkable Records. So it worked very, very well. And then we thought, well, we should do a show and invite some of these amazing people to it. And that was the next step. And that was Jane and my first charity show. We thought, well, we'll do it for charity. We found a great charity, which is one of the landmine charities who dig up landmines that are planted all over the world, that have horrendous consequences for people around the globe. And we brought in Bill Wyman from the Rolling Stones. Now, Bill, I don't know if you're aware of this, Bill has his own band called the Rhythm Kings, and he has some fabulous musicians in there. He has Albert Lee, he has Georgie Fame on organ, and many others. And then we brought in John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin, who has his own trio, an amazing band. We brought in Kiki D, and a guy called Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel. If you're aware of them, anybody listening, if you're not, blimey, then you have some wonderful things to check out. Now, all these people became our dear friends, and we worked with them time and time again after this on all sorts of projects. So it was a great kickstart to the career Jane and I forged in the music business. And as you know well, Wayne, there's nothing like it on the night when the lights go up and the crowd roars and the band plays. It was, every night was a joy. Doesn't come without its frustrations, as again, I'm sure you're well aware. But you always on the night, you recognize, you know what, this is why we're doing it, because this is so great. So our company, Mighty Quinn Management, was quite successful. And suddenly people were coming to us saying, will you manage us? And initially, Jane and I thought, well, you know what, we're spending 24 hours a day just on Julie. Because really, and if I've learned anything over the years working in the music business, really, it is one act. You should be on their case 24 hours a day. But we started bringing in other acts. We brought in quite a few acts from Australia who wanted to come and tour Britain. So they were unknown over there. But again, we found we had a knack for convincing venues to put them on so that they would get a guarantee fee. And then we also were very good at promotion. So we'd get them on local BBC radio near the venue. We'd get them on into interviews with local press, media, which back then, and we're talking the 90s and the first decade of this century, was very, very easy and on local TV to get these acts on and plugged. And so consequently, the tours worked for the artist, worked for the theatres involved, the art centres, whatever, and worked for the audiences and worked for us as managers and agents. So it was a true joy. And meeting our heroes really was a joy. You know, so I remember Jane saying, should we try and see if we can bring Bill Wyman in? Okay, well, I'll stick with where I was at the time. This, if you can see it on the screen, this is Julie Felix. And can I suggest to anybody listening into this broadcast that they go on YouTube and seek her out, because she truly was a joy and sadly missed. Unfortunately, she died a few years ago, bless her heart. A true talent and joy to us all. But working with some of these artists was a blast. I mean, I remember after one gig with Bill Wyman, we were at a venue in Manchester, big city here in near Liverpool. And after the show, I'd organised a party, you know, for all the acts to thank them for for coming, because this was a charity show, so nobody was getting paid. And I went up to Bill after he came off stage and he was walking back to his dressing room. And I said, Bill, you'll come to the party, won't you? And he said, no, I've got to get back in the tour bus and get back to London. And I said, oh, come on, Bill. You know, live dangerously for once. And he stopped in his tracks and he looked at me and he called to the people around him and he said, hey, everybody, did you just hear what Tim said to me? And I said, what? He just told me I should live dangerously. And then he looked me in the eye and said, don't you think I've been living dangerously for the last 40 years with the Rolling Stones? Which, of course, was a fair point and a lovely quote, a lovely moment with a lovely man, I have to say. They all were. I must say, I found everybody that I've worked with a couple of exceptions, to be an absolute joy. They say you should never meet your heroes, but, you know, I disagree with that. Absolutely disagree with that. Here he is. I'm going to bring you right up to date, actually, because here we are in our dotage and still with this love of all things Beatle. I mean, I just found just before I was just flicking through all the memorabilia that I have. And well, hang on, what's this one? That's the very first record I ever bought, and that was pre-Beatles. And that's by a guy called Cliff Richard and the Shadows, which is quite a band over here, well-known band. But then the Beatles came on the scene and everything changed, of course. And absolutely loved everything. From my first year, my life changed on January the 22nd, 1963, when out of my wireless came these four guys. And it was the first time I'd heard them. And they were just released their second single, which was called Please Please Me. And it just stopped me in my tracks. Even though my brother and I were already buying records, we'd never heard anything like this. And I can, even as I recount that moment, I'm back there. And that's, you know, over 60 years ago now. I mean, it's incredible. That moment is and it just got bigger because I didn't even know they were from Liverpool at that time. Little did I know they were living in the same town as me, which I've only found out a few weeks later. Anyway, that love has continued through my whole life. It's why Jane and I got together. We met through the Beatles, funnily enough. because it's kind of impossible for a guy from Liverpool to meet a girl from Fishers, Indiana. That's unlikely. But because of the Beatles, we met. So I'm ever thankful to John, Paul, George, and Ringo and Pete for doing that for us. I'm actually at this moment in time working on a Beatles project, which is going to be huge and is a joy. Every day it brings new joy to me. And I can't say much about it other than that Pete Best and his brother Rogue Aspinall Best. Now, Rogue is an interesting character because his dad was Neil Aspinall, who was the Beatles roadie, and he's Pete's brother, which is interesting in itself. The two of them created a museum in Liverpool just a few years ago, just before COVID kicked in. And the museum is a Beatles museum, and it's directly opposite the Cavern Club in Liverpool. And it's the most fantastic museum because it's got all of Pete's memorabilia from his 2 long years with the band. And it's got all of Neil Aspinall's memorabilia from his period with the band, which was from, well, through the whole life of the band and beyond. So it's an interesting place. And I've been acting as curator to the museum on a few different projects. Earlier this year, because of my background in comics, I went to Pete and Rogue and I said, did you realize that the Beatles have appeared in more comic books and cartoons than any other band, any other act on the planet? They've appeared in hundreds and hundreds. So we started collecting them, and we found that they first appeared in a cartoon back in January 1963, that long back. And of course, by the time they hit the States, they were exploding into, they were even featured in Marvel Comics. So we've got on the 3rd floor of this museum a most beautiful selection of Beatles appearances in comic books, from Mad Magazine to the Fantastic Four to you name it. Anyway, I had a blast putting that together. And then I thought there's another anniversary coming up and I want to celebrate it. And I thought the best way to celebrate it will be by bringing in famous names to help me celebrate it. And I can't say any more other than that some of the names, well, I'll name 2 of them. And one of them is Sir Tim Rice, who's the guy who, along with Andrew Lloyd Webber, did such musicals as Evita and Jesus Christ Superstar, and The Lion King. He wrote The Lion King, and Petula Clark, who is beloved in Great Britain and indeed overseas as well. So they're 2 very strange acts who have come in on this project with me, quite different to each other, but they've been attracted to it. And the nice thing is, whenever I write to these people to say, will you come in on this project, I immediately get a response saying, you bet, yes. Or in Petula Clark's case, just this week, she said, of course. I will name one other person who's come in because he's so tied with the 60s, and that's Bill Mooney, or Billy Mooney, who you may remember from Lost in Space.
We're going to continue this again. I see all kinds of shows. You've whetted my curiosity.
Well, I'm delighted to have whetted anybody's curiosity. I mean, and I'm up to speed on my life because I've reached the stage now where I'm beginning to forget stuff. But luckily, just over a year ago, I was approached by a publisher, and the publisher said, we want you to do your autobiography. So thankfully, I got it down just before I started forgetting it. So now it's all in a book, which is available from a great publisher called New Haven Publishing. And I'm not pushing the book. I'm not saying go and buy the book. I'm saying go to New Haven Publishing site on the internet, because they have so many music-related books about everybody in the music business. They are. I'm so proud to have my books amongst theirs. New Haven Publishing. It's actually based in Norway, but it's available all around the globe. Truly amazing publishing company. So well worth a flick through when you're online.
Well, we'll live to do this again.
I look forward to it, Wayne.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Absolute pleasure. And hello, Indiana, and hello, USA, and hello, everywhere else across the globe.
As part of every show here on Wayback Wayne, we like to recognize those individuals, those rockers from the 60s that have gone on to rock heaven. From the Boys Next Door, we recognize Jim Adams and Steve Drybread. From the Sounds Unlimited, Steve Foster. From the Dawn 5, Dave Dunn. And you might remember from the Dawn 5 interview, that wasn't that long ago. And Dave suddenly passed away, not just a few weeks ago. Mike Nikoloff, Dave McCowan, and Greg Nikoloff. From the Idle Few, Ron Bennett, Rick Webster, Dan McLean. From Ronnie and the Rascals, Ron Blackstone. From the Chosen Few, John Casella. From the End, Dave Crockett and Dennis Rubenstein. From the Waterproof Candle, Dan Hanley. You know, very important to us were the Teen Club owners and operators. Those who have passed. Bouncing Bill Baker, who was synonymous with Westlake. Dick and Joanne Lynn had the Flame Club. Don Holt, who had Whiteland Barn, and Roy Mainers, who had the House of Sound. Over the years, a great time has been had by all. Please let us know of any additions to our memorial. We are working on future episodes that will include hopefully the Boys Next Door, the End, the Idle Few, and we recently made contact with the Olivers. Additionally, special shows coming up will include Garage Band of the 60s website and its creator, a music set from Sir Winston and the Commons, and a music set from the Sounds Unlimited. I also tell you to watch for part 2 of the Dawn 5 feature. That's our show for this day. Hope you enjoyed it. Send in those comments and suggestions and wishes, and we'll do all we can. So until next time, this is Wayne saying, take care. Thanks.